Okay, so what this talk is going to be on, and it's kind of a dialogue as well, so I really just want to know what you guys want to know. But my sense is that a little bit of what I've learned in terms of Ayurveda and living foods, in Ayurveda and invasives and wild foods. All right, so I just want to start with some of the basics. Like, one of the reasons people are attracted to living foods, and living foods are foods that have not been brought above a temperature of 120 degrees. Some people say 112 degrees, but we get the idea. I like the finger test. If you stir it with your finger and your finger starts to burn, the enzymes don't survive and the nutrients shift. So it's a finger test. Don't you love that?
Yes.
Yeah, very, very simple. Okay, so when we talk to people about living foods, what they say, they start to talk a lot about these things called enzymes. So we know enzymes, that there's something happening with enzymes. And then there's also something happening with nutrients. They say, well, like, there's not as many nutrients available when you've cooked foods for when you start to go above that temperature range, that it shifts the chemical structures of the food and the nutrients are diminished. So there's something happening with nutrients. And there's something happening with the energy, like the vitality that people feel. Like, often you talk to people on like a living foods diet who love their living foods diet, and they're like, it just makes me feel so alive. Like, I can feel the aliveness of the food. Has anyone ever had this conversation with someone on living foods and they're like, right, they want that quick energy. And so there's something happening with the energy. And when I look at these three different things going on, it just brings me right to, like, in Ayurveda talk, how we talk about these, and all these different colors, just because of kama, because color is fun, isn't it? Way more fun than black and white. Okay, so energy, we talk about energy in terms of prana, right? And prana is really like what's happening with vata, right? It's prana and vata they're synonymous. Right? You could say the 5 pranas or the 5 vatas. Okay, so we're saying in the world of energy. Enzymes are pitta, right? They're agents of transformation. And nutrients are like the building blocks, or kapha. Right? The actual, like, building blocks of body. So when we look at bodies that are nutrient deficient, right? There's the body, the fabric of the body. I keep saying fabric of physiology. I don't know why I keep saying that, but I feel like I say it in every lecture these days. And it's like, we have this, it's a fabric, right? And it's like, what's its tensile strength? Does anyone know the word tensile strength? Like, it's like, what's its integrity? Like, how much can it do? How much can it flex? And how much can it hold? Yeah, right? So that tensile strength is really like, if there's not enough nutrients, if there's not a diversity also of nutrients, we run into issues with basically we're in issues of the container itself, which in Ayurveda world is how the physical shows up, which is kapha's earth and water element. Yeah, Jamie.
I'm just going to say to complete the chart, because I love it when things line up with enzymes, tejas, pitta, nutrients, kapha.
Yeah, right. So we could take this prana, and we could also say that there's an experience of tejas, which is the feeling of transformation, and then the feeling of ojas, like when we're nutrified. I use this word a lot too. In my spell check, it always shows up as an error, so it's not a word. I'm making things up again. You should see the Body Thrive book. It's like every 10th word, it's like, yep, we're making up a new word. It's better though, and you guys totally get it. All the readers are like, no, we get it. We like the words. So, all right. So,
did you say that? Did you use the word variety in conjunction with
kapha and with nutrients? That one of the things that we're really looking here for, and this is so important that we get, is with nutrients, we need diversification. And this is a huge problem. Right? You go in the grocery store and there's always broccoli and there's always kale now, thank goodness, and there's always, carrots and celery, and they're like the same strain. Like the same strain as bananas. It makes up something, I don't know what the percentage is, but it's like 90% of like the commercially grown banana crop is one species, right? Instead of like celebrating diversity. And this is happening more and more and more. And what we find in that is that the palate, right? So then we have, FYI, for those of you who've not been live with me or seen me draw on a chalkboard, it gets really ugly really fast. So here's our body and here's our mouth. Okay, we'll give the person an eye, maybe some hair. Okay, and there's the body. Okay, and there's the other hole. And right, we've got like the stomach and all the intestines and something. We get it though? We kind of get it. So if we do a 3D close-up then, and we've got one hole and we've got another hole and we've got a lot of piping between those holes. We together here? Yeah. Okay. That each of these, in our Ayurveda, and this has a tongue, that's our tongue. We can make it red, just for reference. that each of these sections is digesting a different, it's like digesting a different taste, right? So we have these 6 sections of taste. We have the 6 tastes: sweet, sour, salty, bitter, pungent, and astringent. I don't want to get into the details, right? But we know that these tastes also show up on the tongue. So that when we blow up an image of the tongue, right, we see that there's different places that we absorb these different tastes. There's different parts of the tongue that absorb these different tastes on the tongue. So that seems important. Like in our Ayurveda, it's obsessive, right? Where we're like, it's a little too sweet. It's a little, there's not enough astringent. Like that these things matter. Why do they matter? Because they're in charge of phases of digestion, which create the nutrient absorption, which gives us our ojas, and ojas is what? Yeah, it's like it's the glue that holds your shit together. I mean your shit, but like, right? It's the glue that holds the universe of you together. So if your ojas is of subpar quality, then you just don't feel as together, physically, mentally, emotionally, right? You're not as strong, you're not as grounded, you're not as anchored and extensive, like able to extend. So it's a problem. So if we know that, if we start to get how all of this work and that these tastes really matter, has anyone noticed when you eat conventional vegetables, they don't taste like anything? Or they like all taste the same? It's really weird, isn't it? Like, it's really freaky to me. I'm like, this should taste like broccoli, but it just tastes like texture. I just get texture, and I don't get flavor. I don't get that complexity. Did anyone notice any trouble tasting things yesterday when we were in the wild? Was anything neutral? Not neutral at all. So that's really interesting too, that like when things are left in a more natural state, the tastes, like they're energetics, right? Like they actually start to have different actions in the body, and it's very toggle switchy. It's like you take it in, things start to happen. So when we look at what's happened with nutrient diversification over time, I mean, I've read different numbers, and one will be released in this podcast coming out this week with Kevin Spellman, but it's something like most Westerners are eating less than 30 species, like something insane, right? And most monkeys in a natural state, and remember we're monkeys or of that lineage, are eating somewhere around 300 different species. 10, or a lot of people that are more on the inner city below poverty level side are eating more like 10 species. Like it's really low, right? And then we start to see, as in yoga communities, we're starting to reach into superfoods, right? Like goji berries and cacao and maca, and like we want spirulina. Like we're like, wait, no, we actually want all these different nutrients. So our numbers are going up. Right? And then when we notice we can't get those superfoods, is anyone just like, I love the superfoods or the super weeds? I love both. It's huge. When I don't get those, I'm like, whoa, this is foggy, right? It's like there's way less going on. So there is a lot of science now, and like I said, Kevin Spellman in that interview that you'll see on the Yogahealer podcast, he talks a lot about why, from a scientific standpoint, this is happening, why nutrient diversification is now being tied to epigenetics and being able to have influence over how your genes evolve, right? And which disease tendencies that you may have inherited, which genetic diseases or imbalances might be shiftable due to nutrient diversification. Go plants, right? Like in go diversity of plants. Okay, so this is sort of the map, the orientation for the idea of Ayurveda and how Ayurveda might look at living foods. When we cook foods, is there less prana? Yes. Absolutely. The yogis have talked about this for years, and they're like, unless you want a really high pranic atmosphere, like, cook your food. And because yogis, especially yogis of yore, who are trying to stabilize their nervous system more, right? And arguably now, like, this is really important with so many people that are just like off the hook, exhausted, depleted. We need to stabilize the nervous system, get grounding in the nervous system. We don't want the diet to be like exceedingly high in prana. We want to kill some of that, we want to cook it out of it. And finding that for you, it might be a day-to-day experience of like, how raw do I want to be today? Or how cooked do I want to be today? Like, what's really going to be absorbable and digestible for me right now? Now, at the same time, we have a ton of people popping digestive enzymes, right? So eating cooked food, but then popping digestive enzymes. Did you guys see this as like, what's going on here? And then we're back to the things in a bottle, like the plants in a bottle, and now we have the enzymes in a bottle, and then, right, it's like soon you'll be able to like inject a yoga class in a bottle, right, in front of like some people would say, like, we already have that, it's called coffee, hello, right? It's like, yes, but it's not quite the same. And the same thing's true is it's not quite the same when we put the enzymes in a pill, and it's not quite the same when we put our nutrients into an encapsulated thing and take it that way, because we bypass a relationship with the plant, right? We bypass the taste, and we bypass so much information that is part of the whole process. Okay, let me go. So now, okay, just a quick review. 6 tastes are important. Why? 6 tastes are connected to the different phases of digestion, which is related to nutrient absorption and the building of the fabric of the physiology, which we call dhatus in Ayurveda, and the end product of the dhatus is ojas. It's like the universe of you and having your shit together. Not your shit, but your shit, right? Okay, so now let's look at that in terms of the 6 tastes in living foods. I need a Vanna White, don't you think? Where I could just like, da-da-da, and then it appears. So we have sweet, sour, salty, pungent, bitter, astringent. And often, we had an apple, I have to interject this, after we tasted all those bitters in the woods, those green things, we went in the car, and my car, the cool car, had an apple, when it was like one of those Sleeping Beauty size apples, like this was like the apple, the end all apples, and we shared this apple. Awesome. And it was so sweet, right? So the other thing that we need to know is that the tastes are in relationship to each other. If you eat a lot of sweets, an apple is almost insanely sweet, and you wouldn't want anything sweeter, like any sort of like processed sugar or even like a date would seem way too sweet, because the sweet is in relationship to the bitter, right? They have that polarity. So when someone has an excessively sweet diet, we know that they're not getting enough bitters, often, right? Often when people have like addictive sweet cravings, they're not getting enough of that opposite in bitter. And sometimes they need sweetness in their life. They need sweetness. It's not a question of like needing sweetness. Like sweet is awesome, right? It's just a question of making sure we understand the whole picture. Okay, so 6 tastes in living foods. I want to also just make on this side, I'm not really sure how this will go. Last time I taught a workshop like this was like honestly like 4 years ago. And I'm like, what did we do? I want to channel what we did because it was really cool. And one of the things that we did is we listed all the ways that when you're into living foods that you're preparing your food, because a living foods kitchen looks really different than like a cooked foods kitchen. We need different apparatuses. We use different things. When we go back into like, does living foods mean that the food isn't warm? No. Does it mean like food's always cold or taken at, refrigerator cold temperature or even room temperature? No. And when we look back and see like, well, what is the history of living foods? Like, were people eating in actually more of a living foods diet in our more, pre-modern years, right? If we go back a few thousand years, like how were we naturally eating a lot more foods? And let's just start throwing those things out there. How are we eating living foods a few thousand years ago? If anyone knows, throw it out there. If anyone wants to guess, throw that out there. And we'll make a big list of things that are actually
berries.
Yeah, so just right off the vine, right? So there's something about that, like off the vine, just like straight off.
Dehydrated,
dried. Yeah, does anyone know the Native Americans in this area, the food they were eating, what that's called?
Goji berries.
Pemmican is the food, right? And it's like dried, it's got all sorts of stuff in it. Super nutritive, like mixes of, I don't even know what's in pemmican, but it's like really nutrient rich. Yeah, and it tastes really weird, right? Because just like the foods in nature taste weird because our palates are fucked up. We got to keep that in mind, right? That like, that was nutrient rich, super digestible, and full of prana. But what's normal isn't. But that tastes good because what's familiar feels better than what's unfamiliar. Like asking people in your circling exercises like to step out of an old vibration and into new vibration. It's like, this doesn't feel good. And it's like, well, it's because it's new. Right? There's just that unfamiliarity. Okay, so I didn't mean to read pemmican. I meant to write dehydrated or dried. Dehydrated. Does anyone hate that word dehydrated? Because like any of the vatas like twitching. Okay, things that can be dehydrated can be rehydrated. So now we have the dehydrated, rehydrated connection. And what is something that happens? This is so cool to get you guys because we got to keep flipping back. I'm not going to, but to the prana or the energy, the enzymes and the nutrients is they survive this process. Okay, so we've got off the vine, we've got dehydrated or rehydrated. Salted, thank you.
Is it fermented?
Fermented! That's one of my favorites. Yeah, and fermented, these categories, you might see like these categories themselves are just, they're just huge. They contain so much. Like there's the world of fermentation, you can ferment liquids, you can ferment, like different concoctions like lemons and salt to create this paste. Or, if you look into other cultures and their cultured foods, you can see it's like, wow, that extends to coffee and chocolate and bread and cheese and all sorts of meats and every vegetable and fruit under the sun. Jamie.
Do you differentiate between fermented and cultured? And if so, what is that?
I don't. No, I consider fermented and cultured the same. Yeah, living cultures, right? So not. Some people will pickle things and use vinegar, and we are not talking about that because the vinegar will kill the enzymes. So when we look at like conventionally made like pickles in the grocery store and how they're different than a living food pickle, is that basically what happened is like once upon a time we were all living in these like more tribal tribal collectives or extended families. Like even in this valley 100 years ago, like families would own regions, right? And so there'd be like 3 or 4 families living within a certain very small area of land. It might be less than 20 acres or less than 100 acres. And so they would, when they were making their pickles, right? Do you think each individual family would make their own pickles? No, they just get all 4 families together and they'd have their pickle making party, right? And then they'd have their elk drying party, right? And they would just help each other out, and we still see this in like Korea today with making kimchi. I have a friend that's Korean. It's like everyone goes home, even from the cities, traveling hundreds of miles to go home for the kimchi making party. They go and they make kimchi, and they make it in these like you know our big tubs the plastic things that we carry stuff around in. Like that's what they're like putting that much kimchi in, and they're like going back and they have their kimchi. They have their year's supply of kimchi. So we're still seeing that. Like this is still happening. When this stopped happening in our country and we left the farm and went to the factory, and food kind of fell, like how are we going to get pickles if no one's home to make pickles, and if it takes 4 women to make enough pickles for a year, right, and that kind of thing, or people. We started to also have the rise of industrialized food, and in order to standardize, because the thing about cultured foods is it's all different. Like your pickles and my pickles are not going to be the same pickles, because there's no way a fermented food can be consistent. It's alive, and alive things change and grow and are totally inconsistent, just like us. And so in order to standardize that your pickle in your store 2,000 miles away from my pickle in my store would be the same, we need to change the process of making a pickle, and we took out the actual culturing or fermentation and just did it with vinegar and high heat, and then we got a really standardized product. But
it was also for hygiene too, like people getting like freaked out about.
Yeah, we can see that with like the raw milk scares in New York almost 100 years ago, or a little over 100 years ago, that there was also like the need for hygiene, but it really is leaving the farm, right? And now we're needing the milk to go from this side of the city into this side of the city, and in that process there's a lot of microbes and heat and stuff exchanged. Yeah.
So what are some of the things that they would ferment with if you don't use vinegar?
So fermentation naturally happens with basically if you crunch vegetables or fruit and vegetables up with a little bit of salt, and they release their own juices, and you stuff it into an airtight container, and it naturally starts to ferment at room temperature for a few days, and then you can refrigerate it or move it into a colder place. Yeah?
So I'm not familiar with any of this stuff as far as food, but why would you ferment?
Because everything's going back to our desire for more energy. Tejas is like illumination. It's like it's like the vibration of intelligence, right? So it's like we want that. We just want to be, our bodies want to be smart. And you see this when like people have bodies that are really just disconnected. You know, if you go into like Walmart or Sam's Club or like a big box store and you see like big people eating big boxes of food that are just, are food out of freezers that have been made in some factory that, we all know the whole scene, right? And we see what food that's not smart. And actually, I love how Dr. Vamamisha calls it dumb food. He's like, is your food dead, dumb, or like smart? And smart is like this whole sense of like, oh wow, what we're putting in determines our experience. So why we would want to eat fermented foods is because we'd want that. And in particular, fermented foods have a ton of enzymes, right? In particular, more than others. That's why when someone's prescribed antibiotics, they're like, eat some yogurt. Why yogurt? Well, just because it's fermented. It's a fermented food that's high in certain types of enzymes that help restore the digestive process. Pharmaceuticals do what in terms of the digestive tract? Yeah, they destroy the microflora, and all the enzymes are going to do is replenish the microflora.
So it's a superfood of its own transformation.
Yeah, it is. Home-batch fermented foods are definitely superfoods in my category. Like, there's just no doubt about my kimchi, you know. Okay, so let's go back and kind of start to connect some of the tastes on this side with some of these fermented and dehydrated, rehydrated, salted, off the vine, and to start to match some of these up. Who wants to take a stab? Sweet, off the vine. Boop. Sour. Sour is going to be fermented. Salty. Salted. We have started to, what is it, dry fish. Yeah, we have this, like, we smoke fish, so smoked. Thank you, smoked. Smoked is also has a little salty, it can be salty, it can also be sweet. Sorry?
Seaweed.
Seaweed is going to be under
Salted.
Yes, it's salty, but it's dehydrated, right? So that's good to know too. Like, the particulars of these open into categories. So we have that, like, seaweed, right? So seaweed can be off the vine, or it can be dehydrated, rehydrated. Does anyone rehydrate seaweed, or not? I'm sure you don't have seaweed dehydration farms. But does anyone rehydrate their seaweed and add it to, like, miso soup? Or, yeah, and it's like you get that boost of chlorophyll and that saltiness. Great.
Vine meaning like berries and stuff you pick.
Apples, any fruits, and vegetables that you're just...
Because it could be sour.
Off the vine can be sour too. Yeah, like off the vine could off the vine go to every one of these categories? Yeah. I would think so, like sour apples, salty seaweed, spices, bitter greens or lemons.
Seeds and nuts could fall in that category.
Yeah, off the vine would be seeds and nuts, right? There's all those different foods. So we're just seeing now, like, there's a lot going on here. Fermented goes to where? Sour. You guys might need a new color here just so we can see things. So fermented is going to go to sour. Salty. Fermented could be salty. That's definitely an option. Definitely could be pungent. Has anyone ever eaten kimchi? Right? The garlic and the red pepper, it's like, whoa, you could digest anything with that stuff. I mean, that's their antibiotic. That's their natural antibiotic, because so they don't get infections in the winter. They don't. Yeah.
What is salted?
So salted, they used to pack, so say you shoot an elk, and then you skin the elk, and you cut all the muscle, and you let it dry on a line. You dry it out, and then you pack it in salt, and it doesn't go rancid. Miso paste is packed in salt. Has anyone ever made miso paste? You know how you, like, have to line all the salt, and you have to pack it in the salt? Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah.
Fermented food, can that exacerbate Pitta?
Oh, sure. We can create an enormous amount of problems.
Okay.
Yes.
Just want to make sure.
Yes. So let's just keep going with this. So fermented, we went to pungent and sour. It can be salty. You can ferment lemons. So you could easily have an astringent. Any fermented sweet foods?
Kombucha.
We could do kombucha with sour and also sweet. And then also things like tempeh or mochi, that's sweet, right? That there's, in Asia, I see a lot of sweet rice fermented types of concoctions.
Where would preserves be?
Like jams and stuff like that. Now we're getting really tricky, right? Because if they're preserved by heat, then we're out. So, like, a lot of canning it's not in here. It doesn't.
Freezing, killing it too.
Yeah, and then there's, like, to what degrees, right? So then the things go from black and white to opening into this whole spectrum where we see, well, there are some nutrients that make it. There are some enzymes that make it. So again, it's 2 degrees. So we could put kind of like in parentheses freezing. Okay, so then smoked smoked would go to, usually to more towards salty, also could be sweet. So what we start to see is that there's ways of having, and fermented could also, yeah, okay, good. You start to be able to go all over the place. But what I want to point out is that these ways of connecting with living foods are often just not part of how we're preparing foods, right? And so we're kind of we might be missing some of the prana enzymes and nutrients tied to the six tastes by not having enough living foods in our diet. And again, we're not saying like all or none. It's a yes and. Do I need some fermented foods in my diet? We'll go for another couple minutes because they're not quite ready yet. Are we having whiteboard fun? Yes. Okay, so we'll now talk about the doshas, so sweet, sour, salty, pungent, bitter, and astringent. And we'll talk about the doshas. It's interesting too to think of like in terms of the phases of digestion, how these different tastes are happening between mouth and anus. When you first taste the food and your mouth releases enzymes, bodhaka kapha, right? There's the saliva that's released and there's enzymes within the saliva that start to break down the food. We start to really be able to taste. Now, if you're intelligent, meaning in this old school way of that the intelligence is in here, it's mouth to anus intelligence, your cravings are intelligent. So if you eat something that's not real, right, some artificial food, your body's like, ugh, chemical. Has anyone ever had this experience after a cleanse where it's like there's a whole new category that's not food? Right, you put it in, you're like, whoa, Ben & Jerry's ice cream is not food, it's plastic. Like, and you just have that, like, this is not real, right? Or you taste something and you're like, oh, I can taste the ugh, or like, wow, the
No, in Ben & Jerry's. What is it?
What is it? It's like, it's not what I'm looking for, right? It's the body saying this isn't what I'm looking for. The natural experience in that is then to spit. Right? So it's so important that we honor that, like spit, don't swallow, that first taste, right? If it's like your body's just spit. And then we get that also, like that sweet taste is absorbed more in the upper part, in the kapha region, which is mouth to stomach, right? This is the region of kapha. Kapha, physical body is here, right? Emotional body is here, is the grounding. Vata, physical body is here in the colon, emotional body is like heart-head connection, inspiration. Pitta just this is the domain. Doesn't matter what we're talking about, right? It's all about this digestion, power, transformation. So the sweetness, like when we eat food and it's like, oh, it's sweet, we actually relax. Most food is sweet, like all grains, all meats, most fruits have some sweetness to them. All milks, seeds, nuts have sweet. And so most of our food stuff is sweet. Yesterday we were talking about medicinals, and like medicinals are generally not sweet. The only sweet medicinal is licorice root. That's not the only one, but that's the one that's most commonly used. And in Chinese medicine, licorice root is in almost every formula. Why?
Because it makes it relaxing enough to take it.
It's balanced.
Yeah, because you could take it orally. That's a really good one. You're not just like, ugh. It has a lot of energetics that has a stabilizing component for all the other actions to take place without doing wreaking too much havoc. Did you have something to add?
Oh, I just said it grounds the formula.
It grounds the formula, exactly. It creates the container for the formula. So when we first eat, that's sweet. There's that sense of like, and the whole body's supposed to go, and relax and enjoy. And it's that pleasure and joy we were talking about earlier in the Vijnana Bhairava. All right, so if this is intelligent, our tastes are intelligent, and we also start to taste like, ooh, this is too bitter for me, or ooh, this is too pungent for me. And that gets to Vanessa's question about, like, can sour, what happens with fermented foods in Pitta? And so what we see is like sour is Pitta increasing. Interestingly enough, sour, even though it's heating, is also kapha increasing. Does anyone know why?
increases appetite. Increases fluids.
Yes, it's hydrophilic. Sour helps us retain. So if you're Vata and you're like drinking water because you feel so dry and your mouth is dry and your skin is dry and your poop is dry, like water might not be your answer. Pickle juice, now we're talking.
But then I thought, like, if you add citrus to water, that's drying.
Well,
Like
lemon or lime.
I said pickle juice. Sour, so pickle juice. I'm talking fermented foods. So if we add the liquids of fermented foods, it's also why like miso soup might feel like, because there's a sour quality that's hydrophilic that helps the tissue absorb the water, hold on to the water. Philic means love, so loving water. Phobic means like, get rid of it, right? So sour taste is Pitta increasing, Kapha increasing, Vata reducing.
I mean, salt is the same then for Vata.
Wait, let's not go there. You guys are so psyched. We're just jumping all around, but let's take care of one thing at a time. Get organized. So we have here, remember sour we said was which foods, which fermented food, or which, giveaway, fermented foods. Primarily. So fermented foods, does that mean Pittas can't eat like any fermented foods who are on a living foods diet? No. It just means that they shouldn't be so intense. Like they don't need to be the most, they should be drinking like kombuchas 2 times a day between teaching yoga classes. Like that's probably too much. It's probably inappropriate, right? And they'll probably develop Pitta imbalances from that. But maybe having like a little bit of miso soup before dinner or having a little bit of fermented vegetables. I use really mild sauerkrauts is what I prefer. It's like just cabbage with a little bit of caraway or a little bit of cumin seed. And that's all that's in it. Or if my Pitta's even higher, I'll actually put apple in it. Something even sweeter to balance some of that fermented. So this is what happens when we have small batch homemade fermented foods, is you're just designing stuff that's for you. And you're like, that's too hot, that's not hot enough, this needs a little bit more, for me. And that's kind of how that works. So sour is always needed. Sweet, this is the off the vine. Doshically, sweet does what with Pitta? What does it do with Kapha? And what does it do with Vata? Right, does that mean Kaphas can't eat any sweet food? No, it just means that we know that if like a Kapha just eats fruit all the time, and I've gone through phases like this of eating way too much fruit, and I just get fat on fruit. In Mexico, there's like these papayas and bananas and pineapples and avocados and mangoes, and they're all ripe and juicy and dirt cheap, and it's like, oh my gosh, it's just, right? Because it's just like sugar, right? So we know that with Kapha it does that, but with Vata and Pitta it chills out Pitta. Sweet taste is cooling, but it's also relaxing, which is why it's also so good for Vata. So slightly cooling, not cold. Salty taste does what to Pitta? Increases. Does what to Kapha? Increases. And does what to Vata? Decreases. I'm just going to go back and fill out with sweet. We said primarily off the vine, so fresh food. Okay. And that would include like roots, nuts, seeds, right? Meats, grains. Those are all happening in sweet category. Back to salty. We have salt itself. We have seaweed, and then adding those to foods. Even like celery has natural salts, but in general, the way we take in salt is just through salt. When we know that that this does this, like if a Kapha eats a lot of like salted, like even like my smoked fish is really kind of salty. Like you taste it and you're going to taste salt. So that would be aggravating to Kapha. For a Kapha to have a lot of miso soup or a lot of seaweed in their diet might also really aggravate. Just too much salt in the diet will cause them to bloat. But for Vata, it's pacifying. For Pitta, and this is somewhat debatable, but it's heating. And we can feel it often as Pitta. If it's like if you have too much salt, you'll just notice you're just going to be more likely to get more intense, critical, or just hot. Okay? Pungent. We have spices. Does what to Pitta? Does what to Kapha? Does what to Vata? Increases. Why does it increase Vata? Vata's cold. Pungent is hot. Why does it?
Drying.
Drying's astringent.
the fire, then is it more maybe?
Yeah, it can increase movement, right? It could just be like, it can be way too intense, right? There's this just super intensity. Anything that's intense is like Vata can't handle it.
Yeah. But I like it.
But we like it. Okay. So the pungents, so now we're like, again, are we going to add hot peppers to everything and like, you know, the hot sauce or too much ginger or whatnot? Like pungents mostly going to show up in terms of spice. It'll also show up in terms of like mustard greens, radish greens, like the pungent taste in greens. And so when we have that, it's just like, it's just too much. Okay, but it's also a preservative, right? So like using like the garlic and the red peppers actually will help the kimchi stay longer. Bitters, does what to Pitta, does what to Kapha, and does what to Vata, right? And again, we have the extremes, the intensities, the bitters mostly off the vine, and also dried, right? Does anyone dry greens, nettles, thistles, wildcraft stuff? And if you dry it, yeah. We also didn't talk about tinctures, which goes into sour, right? And so if we like take a lot of tinctures as our form of taking herbs, it's going to aggravate Pitta, according to Ayurveda, with the alcohol and the fermentation. And astringent does what to Pitta?
Aggravates.
And does what to Kapha?
Decreases.
And does what to Vata? Increases, right? And that's where we have, again, drying is going to make more of an astringent process on things, which is why Vata's kind of edge away from it. So if we dehydrate and rehydrate, we're going to want to also take that into account for Vata, maybe add more salty, maybe add a little bit of pungent to increase the digestibility, balance the taste.
It's kind of not really, kind of related to anything, but in terms of like herbs,
Yeah.
that have like herbal formulas, like Ayurvedic herbal like prescription for like a high Vata, let's see, bitter would be not good.
But it may have some bitter because we may have we want to maybe take into account what is happening in the deeper levels of digestion and absorption. So we might use a bitter just to target the colon and to get that kind of like extraction. So it's not so simple. It gets really kind of, but it always makes sense of like, oh, we might need something bitter to direct the other herbs to the colon where the bitter is absorbed. Bitter helps to, in the astringent, those later parts of digestion start to pull all the minerals out of our foods into our bones. Some people are like, why are you obsessed with thistle? I'm like, the minerals.
And would it also
This shit's amazing. Like, you know what I mean? Like, I feel the minerals going out of my colon and into my bones. Like, that's what it feels like. That's what that deeper levels of absorption. But to do that, the colon has to like pull all the water out to make the feces, right? And so there's that extraction of water that pulls things in, and the bitter and astringent tastes are down here. So when we're trying to target more absorption, we're going to probably want to use some bitter and astringent taste to just direct things to the colon.
And if the Vata is like, that's its home and its seat,
Yeah.
and it's too much,
Yeah.
the bitter and astringent will stir it up.
You'll stir it. Yeah, well, then we look into balanced formulas. Like one of the best balanced formula from Ayurveda for the colon is Dashmula, which means 10 roots, mula meaning root. And a lot of those roots have a lot of these different energetics, but their primary quality, like, has anyone ever smelled Dashmula? It's sweet. It's really grounding and it's an earthy sweet. It's not like a candy sweet, but for the realm of herbs, compared to like smelling cinnamon or smelling yarrow, you're like, whoa. If you had to choose among plants, like, wow, that's sweet. So it's going to have that as its main like grounding energetic, but it's going to have the other tastes in it. Yeah. Yeah.
So if you were dealing with malabsorption, and
Yeah.
the astringent and bitter are good for absorption.
Well, we need them all for absorption. Yeah.
I understand that. I'm just trying to break this down because I'm hearing this correctly. I'm sorry. You said that bitter and astringent disrupt Vata, but the absorption takes place in the colon, which is the seat of Vata. The absorption. See where I'm going?
Yeah. It's like whenever I'm thinking malabsorption, like one of the first places I go is fermented. Like I want the person making small batch fermented foods religiously and just starting to increase the amount of enzymes in their gut just to restore the flora and to really taste. Like what is the right taste in their fermented foods? If that was too sour, then how do we make it more sweet? If it's not pungent enough, like what are the right pungents? And getting them to start to feel into the right mix of the 6 tastes in their own digestive tract. Has anyone ever noticed that fermented foods are laxative? Has anyone ever had that experience of like, whoa, that worked? Right? And it just helps the entire process digest, evolve. It helps things move along. But for people with like excessive, too much moving, and it's more vata moving than pitta, and pitta is not aggravated, fermented foods are going to help. But if pitta is aggravated and vata is aggravated, then we have to do small batch fermented foods, like small amounts, like just a bite before a meal, just a little bit, and then that can start to help. Yeah. So with malabsorption, I always go to fermented foods, and I also look at some of the greater picture of the right mix of living foods and cooked foods in the diet overall to make sure that they're getting the enzymes, the prana, and the nutrients in the most absorbable form for their constitution. Yeah.
So quick question. So a lot of times we do, we're told to take apple cider vinegar before a meal.
Yeah.
Then if the vinegars enzymes.
Right. What's happening there? So in Ayurveda, we're never told to use vinegar. Like vinegar is out in Ayurveda. Like, I mean, it's really interesting because you go to Italy and like vinegar's in, and from like the pH people, like the apple cider vinegar comes from like the pH balancing people. We know that vinegar is aggravating to pitta, right? But can it be balancing to kapha and vata? Like in small amounts, I'm absolutely sure. Like yes, and more to, I'm just going to leave it at that. If we look overall, though, like taking a teaspoon or a tablespoon or whatever of apple cider vinegar to balance your pH does not make any sense from an Ayurvedic perspective. Or from a living foods perspective. Because why isn't your pH balanced? And how is just taking a little hit of something that's aggravating to pitta, and even if you're not pitta, it's still aggravating your pitta, so your pitta is going to be, even if you're a vata kapha, it's going to be an aggravated pitta. Like everyone has all 3 doshas, right? So even though you might not be vata, it's like, how is your prana flowing? Is it aggravated? Is it jumpy? Is it fluid? Is it stuck? Right? And the same thing's true with pitta. Like, what's the quality of the transformational energy in your body? Is it like pissed off? And so from an Ayurvedic perspective, if we use vinegar a lot, it's going to make our pitta pissed off. It'll tweaky.
It's like using vinegar and oil in your salad.
Right, and I use it. I mean, I'm not just like a lemon juice, lime juice only kind of gal, but I do notice if I use too much vinegar, my pitta gets tweaked out. Like, and I'll get those little things on my tongue, and you get those?
Yes, right, like right away when I take it.
Yeah, it's like your pitta saying like, no more, thank you.
Yeah, and vinegar too, it'll actually take, if you get lower blood pressure, it actually drops, it'll drop your blood pressure.
It'll drop your blood.
I mean, like apple cider vinegar doesn't seem to do that. Yeah,
Okay, so let's just talk about this pH thing really quick, because this is, and then we'll end and eat lunch. Yes. Your pH can change based on stress. Okay, so that's one of the first things we need to look at. Is the person stressed out all the time? Because if they are, they're going to naturally have a lower pH. They're living in an acidic environment that's created by their experience of being stressed. So to me, that's always the first and most obvious one now. It used to be like the percentage of fruits and vegetables, primarily vegetables, and then the most alkaline of the fruits and vegetables in their diet. And we go to that acid alkaline chart in there. The living foods movement is really obsessed with that too, right? So we have these different food movements that are obsessed with different things. If we have pH, and we have the 0, 7, 14, and we're supposed to be hovering somewhere around here. And we know that stress is over here. Stress brings us here. Ease brings us over here. It's like why meditation works for everything. And then we also know that like anything that's like a drug, anything that's artificial is like way over here with like crack. The pH of crack is really low, right? But also like alcohol, also like coffee, like all that stuff is on this side. And as we get closer to here, we just get healthier, or we get different foods, not necessarily healthy foods, but we get more like like beans and legumes and meats and stuff like that are going to be below. Fruits and vegetables are going to be over here. Things that I believe, and we should look into this, but like things that are fermented, some people say that it starts to push over here, that the consistency changes. I've also heard that you can't change the consistency of food in preparation. It's pH, so that's controversial. But the idea is that if we, again, if we look at stress ease first, and if second, we just look at like what percentage of what they're eating is on this side, and what percentage of what they're eating is on this side. And if they have too many grains and too many meats and too many legumes that are between the 0 and 7 in their diet, in relationship to the more of the fruits and vegetables and herbs and plant medicines, then they're just, it's like meditations at some point won't help that shift. Apple cider vinegar is not going to help that shift if we don't have that 1 and 2 taken care of. Yes.
Sorry, this is really like, this has been a topic of my thinking a little while ago, and I researched it, and it was really driving me nuts because the body is always in homeostasis. The body is always a 7 point something or other. Like that, let's say it's 7, because I don't know the exact number. And what I'm getting like a little bit of a reaction in terms of language, because what we eat can't change our pH balance because we're always in homeostasis.
It's the ash of the food. It's like when you measure like it's like a pH ash of the food that comes out in our saliva. Like that have you ever taken a saliva test with a pH stick? Yeah. And you know how it doesn't come out the same? If you take it for a few weeks, it'll often come out different. So that's the change we're measuring. And it has something to do with how like the ash of the food affects the pH in our saliva.
The way it comes out.
Just like the digestion of how it, it's a good question, and we can look it up, but there's like just a really, how we eat, and it's like the ash of the digestion, right? Like the process of the digestion shifts our saliva, and that's why we can measure pH on a saliva stick. Or you can measure it in terms of your pee. But
in the body itself, we are at that 7 point whatever pH always, only the way it comes out.
Not necessarily.
Yeah, not necessarily. Yeah.
I mean, what I personally got to in this whole process of thinking is like, well, if we eat a lot of acidic foods, the body has to work harder to be in homeostasis. So what it does, it pulls minerals and vitamins out of the bones, and it causes stress to the body, and therefore we're not as healthy, or something like that.
Yeah, I think just in terms of this, just understanding that when we measure urine or measure saliva, we're going to see a spectrum, and that's what we're talking about in terms of measuring.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll take that.
Okay.
The spectrum is minuscule.
Yeah, it's like right in here.
0.001 to 7.003, but it makes a huge difference.
It's exponential.
Minuscule changes in pH. So no, it can't swing dramatically, but those minuscule changes make a big difference.
No, it can go from 6.8.
Yeah, it can go on this side.
It can go the pendulum.
I don't think that's true.
No, when somebody has cancer, it's like way over.
It's low. But yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, for everybody, it might be helpful to think of like, it's like an earthquake, it's exponential, like each measurement is like, if it's 7.1 earthquake, 7.2 is 10 times bigger.
Yeah.
So the little increments are also big.
pH power of 5 to the power of, like, it's a lot.
To the power of a lot. So what we have here, just to kind of pull it together and wrap up and go eat, is that these are just different maps, right? These are all different maps of the territory. And whenever we hear of like a new diet, like the what's big right now, the Paleo's big right now. It's like we just want to understand it in terms of all of these different maps. We want to then unfold that diet on these different maps, and we can make almost any diet Ayurvedic. if we understand the maps, right? And we kind of understand what's happening. Like, what's the best thing about paleo? There's no processed food.
Yeah,
Right? How can anyone not get healthier on paleo who's eating a processed food diet? So whatever your judgments are against paleo and eating meat or whatever, like chances are that person's going to be more healthy, more connected, more awake, more aware of what they're eating. And that's, from my perspective, what we're always looking for in terms of diet, whether it's like living foods or whatnot, is that we can use some of these maps, some of these understandings, that we can use food to bolster our health, to really take our awareness to a level that we're desiring. When we have, again, back to nutrient diversification, because this is what I'm personally obsessed with, like this is the angle that I work, right? Like, how do we get more nutrients into people's diets? How do we get people more connected to, because on the other side of all this is plants. Right? So plants is like really the seat of all food. How do we get more connected to plants? Not just any plant, but lots of different plants. Right, lots of different plants in the places we go. And when we do that, we start to develop a relationship, and we start to see that, like, oh, these are alive. We actually treat them differently. We start to energetically be more connected. They start to inform us. The plants actually inform us of, like, I would be good in your kimchi. You know, like, throw me in there. You know, and we start to have, like, these different ways of food preparation. And what happens with the whole world of food preparation is that starts to change over time based on what we need. And right now, most of us spend a lot of time within EMFs, right? And this whole electromagnetic field. We have, like, 35 cell phones in the room right now, right? Like, there's just a lot of us spend time on computers and whatnot. And what we find is that, like, our diets are going to need to change based on how our lifestyle is. And so letting that happen in terms of your food preparation, in terms of your nutrient diversification, in terms of the taste that you're using, the different processes, and let that be an experiment in action, and to not get fixed, and to not get judgmental about it on yourself or what everyone else is doing. It's just, to me, it's like it's a huge key of this whole path of awake living. Yeah.
Quick question about Vitamixes and juicers.
Yeah.
And enzymes. There's
Oh yeah, like if you're it's like if you're not using the right process, like to what degree are you killing stuff? To me, it's like to the nth degree, right? So it's like if you want to live at that nth degree, then do the research and find the best, like, centrifugal and if you're just getting into it, like, just put stuff in a blender and press go. It doesn't, because it's like, what degree are we going to notice? To me, I'm going to notice a lot more if I develop a relationship with the plants that grow outside my door than if I have the exact right centrifugal versus, masticating, right? Like, there's this whole language out there. But if you're at the nth degree, do the research and just follow the longevity conference people like David Wolf, and you'll find exactly the best technology for that.
Would you say that's hold true for making that smoothie and then going and teaching a yoga class and drinking it an hour and a half or 2 hours later versus right away? It's like just as long as...
To me, it's the nth degree. Like, the percentage of lost prana, enzymes, and nutrients. It's like, compared to what?
Yeah.
Stressing yourself out? If you stress yourself out, you blew it anyway. Yeah. Right? Right. Or if you're, like, making everyone else annoyed around you because you're so freaking neurotic about what you're eating, you missed the boat. Awesome. Let's enjoy a lovely lunch, and then we'll go for a lovely hike. Thank you.